So in this video, we are going to set up two cameras looking at this cube in this scene, and then we're going to add logic to be able to switch between those two cameras. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to come up to add and then camera, which is going to put a camera right in the center of my scene. It's actually inside the cube, so I can't see it right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, with my camera selected up here, I'm going to press GX and drag that camera out a little bit like that, just so I can see it. While I'm at it, I'm going to rename these cameras up here. I'm going to call this camera 1 and camera 2, just so it's better for me to reference them when I'm creating the logic. And what I want to do, I think, is we can actually right click on this and say set as active camera. It'll jump into that camera. So we have a couple different ways to do this. We can, when we're in this camera view, we can, and the camera selected, we could press R to rotate and kind of rotate the camera around. That's a little tricky though. I don't know if I like that. We can also press G to grab the camera and kind of pan it around, but also that's kind of tricky. The easiest thing I found to do is kind of position yourself where you want to be. So maybe I want a camera right on the x-axis like this. So if this is my active camera, and I can make sure it's my active camera by going up to View, Objects, and then Set Active Object as Camera, which actually switches into it. But if I press numpad 0, I should go back out to my original view. I can then go up to View, Align Active Camera to View, which will move the camera I have selected, or the active camera I have, to my current viewpoint. Okay, so now I have two cameras here. I have one pointing straight at my cube along the x-axis, and then I have my original camera kind of looking down at it from an angle over here. If I press numpad 0, you can see my original camera, camera 1, off to the side here, outside the view of the camera. All right, so now I want to create logic to be able to jump back and forth between these cameras. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand this viewport down here. I'm going to go and select Logic Bricks Editor. So we have no real way to detect which camera is active, but we could use properties to do that. So what I'm going to do is on camera 1, I'm going to create a property. So I'm going to click on Add Game Property. I'm just going to call this isActive. I'm going to make this a Boolean. And this camera up here, I think I want this to be my original active camera. So I'm going to check this one so that this one is initially active. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sensor that'll allow me to switch cameras. I'm going to use the space bar. So I'm going to call this space, but I also have to click down here to set the key to space bar. And while I'm here, I'm going to select tap. This will make it so this only triggers once when I press the key. If you don't have this and you have this set up on both cameras, what you'll end up with is you'll jump back and forth between the cameras very, very quickly. So tap is what I want. I only want this to fire once every time I hit the space bar. So if the user presses the space bar and the camera is active, so I actually need a second sensor here, a property sensor. I'm going to call this isActive. And the way I'm going to check that is I'm going to set the property isActive and check to see if that value is true. if both of those are true. Now I'm going to do two things. I'm going to set the camera I'm on to inactive, and I'm going to switch to the other camera. So that's two actuators, two actions. Property, set inactive. Now I'm just calling it set inactive so I know what this does, but that doesn't like affect how this works. I actually have to come down here and say I want to set the property is active to false. And then I'm going to use the scene actuator to switch between cameras. I'm going to call it next camera. I'm going to use the mode set camera. Now I can actually click the drop down here and select which camera I want, or I can use the eyedropper and click on the camera up here. Both will work, and I'm going to connect those all up here. Okay, so I'm going to right click on my camera 1. I'm going to say set active camera. If I press P for play and press space, I switch to the next camera. All right. Numpad 0 to get out of that. I want to set up similar logic on my camera 2. So I'm really going to just go through the same exercise again. I'm going to set up a property is active. I'm going to make that a Boolean. And since this one is not initially active, I'm going to leave it unchecked. But I'm going to have the same logic again. If the user presses the spacebar, and I want that to be a tap, and the property is active is true, then what I want to do is set this camera to inactive. So I'm going to call this set inactive. I'm going to set is active to false. And then I'm going to use the scene actuator, next camera, to set the camera equal to camera 1 and link that all up. All right, there's one more thing we need to do at this point. So we have the logic to move from this camera to this camera. We have the logic to move from this camera to this camera. But what we need to do is when we switch cameras, we need to tell the other camera that it is now the active camera. So the way we do that, I'm going to minimize these, is I'm going to select both cameras. So now I have camera 1 and camera 2 in my logic bricks down here. I need to add an actuator to camera 1 and camera 2. A property actuator. I'm going to call it set active. And that's going to assign the value of true to is active. So I actually have two. I have one set inactive, which sets is active to false, and I have set active, which sets it to true. I'll do the same thing down here. I'll pull this up a little bit so you can see. So I'm going to call this set active, and that's going to set is active to true. And then my logic is going to kind of crisscross, because when camera 1 switches to camera 2, it's going to tell camera 2 that it's active. And then when camera 2 switches to camera 1, it's going to tell camera 1 that it's active. So you'll see that these lines kind of overlap a little bit. I'll leave that up so you guys can see it. What I'm going to do is press numpad 0 up here. I'm going to press play. So I'm on this camera. If I press space, I jump to this camera. I can hold the space down, but it's not going to jump between cameras because I have that tap on there. It should only fire once. I can look at my cube from 2 different sides. Okay, this concludes this lesson. Thanks for watching and happy blending.